the Hunchback of Notre Dame occurs at a very interesting time in the history of Western civilization, because you're talking about the late 1400s. It's set in 1482. And the Roman Catholic Church had moved further and further away from early Christianity. And there were a lot of reform movements in the 1400s. And especially as you move into the late 1400s, those reform movements become more and more common. In the early 1400s, you have movements like the Lollards, who were led by John Wycliffe in England. And then later John Huss, his movement was known as the Hussites, and they began to criticize the late medieval church for many of the problems with doctrine and with practice and with corruption in the church among the clergy and the hierarchy. You have these movements in the early 1400s, and as you move through the 1400s, you have people like Wessel Gansfort, who starts a movement called the Brethren of the Common Life. And these are people who are very concerned about Scripture and its teachings. And a lot of this comes because of the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is looking back at the fonts, the fountains, and the knowledge in Greek and Hebrew and the old books, not only the Bible, but the church fathers and other ancient books, and they're learning them in the original Greek and Hebrew and Latin. And so this is the intellectual milieu into which this reform movement begins taking place, because these people are going back to the fathers and they're going back to the Scriptures. And so they want to reform the church according to what they're finding in these early Christian teachings in the New Testament and in the early church fathers. And so you begin to have much more concern about the biblical purity of the church, and a concern that the church has moved away from the doctrine of the New Testament, from the teachings of the New Testament, from the practice of the New Testament, the worship of the New Testament in early Christianity. And along with this, the emphasis is getting more and more away from Scripture and more away from holiness. And the emphasis is more and more towards corruption and power and money. And so you begin to see very soon the sale of indulgences, so that you can buy your way out of purgatory by buying an indulgence to support the construction of a particular cathedral. And so it's very interesting that the Hunchback of Notre Dame occurs in a period in the 1480s that's just a few decades before the Protestant Reformation, where Martin Luther is nailing his 95 Theses to the church and saying something has to change. And so they're wanting to get back to the purity of Scripture in doctrine, in practice, and in the moral way that they live. And so this involves things like Scripture alone. There's more of a clamoring for, we need to get back to the richness of Scripture. And we don't need to add all these doctrines and practices to what we find in Scripture and in early Christianity. And grace alone and faith alone. We're not saved by merit or by works or by the sacraments. We're saved by God's grace alone. And we're justified by faith alone. And then doctrines like Christ alone. We don't have mediators between us and God, like the saints and Mary. As much as we appreciate and value them, they are not mediators. Jesus is the only mediator between us and God. And to the glory of God alone. We do not worship God in a way that glorifies man. We do not have the pomp and circumstance of the Roman Curia and all of the money that's being raised for the Roman Curia to prop up this theology of glory. But instead we have the theology of the cross. We are worshiping God and the beauty of His holiness. And so these are some of the criticisms that these Reformation according to the Scripture movements had of the late medieval Roman Catholic Church. And this corruption, this graft, this greediness, this hypocrisy that you see in the Hunchback of Notre Dame is very much an object of a lot of the criticism of these reform movements.